Let me start with, I want to ask all of you sort of this question, if I may, this opening question, and that is, will the coronavirus pandemic change capitalism as we know it? And to the extent that it's happening, how big of a change are we seeing? Eric, from where you're sitting in China, is that how would you describe how the situation has panned out there? Obviously, the pandemic started there, but yet China took swift action, and now the Chinese economy is rebounding. The state obviously played a major role in that. Describe to us, if you would, sort of that interaction. How is that changing capitalism, Chinese capitalism as we know it?
Well, thank you. First of all, let me say that I'm happy to report that things are going great here. We've been back to normal for a long time, since April and May, although albeit Q2 was somewhat slower than before. But when we began the summer, everything was going on full steam. I'm a venture capitalist. I've got a lot of companies. Virtually all of them have been going on full cylinders, all cylinders. So I've been busier than ever, traveling everywhere in the country. It's a big country. I haven't been able to fly internationally, but it feels like I've been flying just as many kilometers domestically in the last few months. I've been flying internationally. So business is going great. We pretty much eliminated, I believe, the pandemic. So that's the good news. But to answer your question, obviously, I don't live in a capitalist society. I live in a socialist country. So perhaps let me address the question as capitalism in the capitalist world, if you will. Capitalism is a loaded word, of course. Nobody knows what it means. But the short answer is to the question whether the pandemic is changing capitalism as we know it. My answer is it should, but it probably won't. Because capitalism in the capitalist societies around the world has gotten into a state where, I would call it political capitalism, or some people call it neoliberalism, which really means that capital or special interests that represent capital have captured the political system for their own good. And it's being ossified without drastic political reform. I don't think you can change capitalism for the better to solve problems like the pandemic. And the pandemic really has what has revealed is this great dysfunction in governance in many capitalist societies or liberal societies, if you will. And we're seeing a total degradation of governance, of state capacity to solve problems for the collective. And I think it's a political problem, not an economic problem. So it'll be very, very difficult to solve.
Let me turn, if I could, to our panelists who are actually physically here in the room with us. How can companies, especially at a time like this, get the trust of more people, also in an economic environment where, despite noble pledges that are being made, the economic reality is going to be very harsh. We're going to see rising unemployment, more social distress. Talk to us about those challenges and how you're navigating them.
Yeah, happy to. So if I also go back, Liz, to your question of saying, will COVID change capitalism? I would suggest to us that the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. And by that, I mean it already has changed it. Even just looking at the New York Times, was it 2 weeks ago? The special edition that you did on essentially the commentary on the Milton Friedman essay. 50 years on. And essentially that was a bit of a mea culpa that says actually that didn't work. It didn't work in terms of really making sure that we had people who could find safe livelihoods and also within our planetary boundaries. And so if you look at then saying that was a seminal shift, I believe, that is ushering in a clarity that says there's an awareness that capitalism as we knew it, this Friedman ideology hasn't provided for freedom for human beings. We're here talking about democracy and the ability to live a great life as human humans and find meaningful work and be connected. So what I see and we have seen is there is an awareness and an agreement that it hasn't worked. That's the starting point for understanding that it's different. So when we have CEOs coming together and say, how can we help the EU Green Deal not become a brown deal? That is, how do we work with the regulators to say, how do we create the right incentives for us to be able to do what we know we need to do to help transform, if that case, food and agriculture, in other cases, fashion. So I think it's already happening. And I think the other thing that isn't a done deal, and this is the part that really worries me, is, you know, Eric was saying here in China, it's back to normal. And I remember a CEO, and I shared this story with you before as well, a CEO, a woman who was in China, and she told me, she said, you know, Valerie, I am the future, because what's happening here is just as Eric said, you know, there's hope for you guys. It can be normalized as well with where you are. She said, I'm like anybody else. I understand that there's no planet B. I know that business has a social and environmental responsibility. I see the data that says ESG companies have actually outperformed by 66% others in this environmental crisis. She said, but if to be honest with you, when I see the smog coming back over Shanghai, I'm encouraged because I feel like we're back on track.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the big challenge going forward, though, is that those are important pledges that companies are making, but we're also in a global economic environment in which we're facing a huge challenge, and that is a significant decline in demand, a huge change in our social behavior that is going to shift entire industries and that won't necessarily allow companies that are making those kind of pledges to be able to stick to them. Beata, I wanted to come back to you on the role of governments, because we're seeing governments basically having to step in a huge way during this crisis to support societies, to also support businesses, coming forward with a huge amount of spending, and being present, having big government present in a way that has been almost unprecedented for a number of decades. Can you talk to us about, you know, how long would you expect that dynamic to last? And also, you know, how we're also in a number of analyses out there say that we're also creating basically zombie companies with all of this support. So can you talk to us about basically how you see that unfolding?
An excellent question, Liz. So as you have said, we've seen governments protecting jobs. And it's a good idea to protect jobs for 3 months, but protecting jobs for 3 years is not sustainable. So what we need to do is to focus on protecting workers, not protecting jobs. We don't want to freeze the economy as it was in February, because the world has changed. We have changed the way we consume services. We've changed the way we consume entertainment. We've changed the way we shop. So what we need to do is allow restructuring of economy taking place, and in particular, restructuring with an eye on green transformation.
And Eric, from where you sit, how feasible does all of that sound to you?
Well, look, this morning I was reading Wednesday's New York Times. I get the paper a day late here in Shanghai. And on the front page, there's this big story and a very big picture, very sad picture, showing that the fashion industry in capitalist societies have destroyed India's rivers. Okay, and all the communities around those rivers, their lives and livelihoods destroyed because of the fashion industry in capitalist societies. They're so demanding. The dyes, you know, moved into river. The rivers that used to be pristine 10, 20 years ago are now uninhabitable. And it's very, very sad story. I'm very supportive of what Valerie is saying, but I just don't think it's going to work. This corporate social responsibility idea, I mean, we've had that for a long time. I mean, we've been talking about that for 25 years. I remember back in the days when business school, we were talking about it. 20, 25, 30 years ago. I mean, if it works, it should have worked. Okay, it doesn't work. Businesses are not built this way. I mean, I'm not a fan of Milton Friedman, but I'm afraid he was right in his technical analysis that companies are built to deliver profits to their owners. I mean, unless you're telling me that you're going to appoint people who represent communities' interests or other interests onto the boards of those companies, I just don't think it's going to work. It hasn't worked for 25 years. I mean, all the arguments I hear today, I used to hear them when I was a very, very young man in business school. Okay, everything, a repeat. And look at, I mean, tell that to the people who live on those rivers in India. Okay, 2 generations have passed. So my answer is, I just don't think the answer is in the hands of CEOs. The answer is in the hands of political leaders. But those political leaders in capitalist societies are in the pockets of special interests. So without drastic political reforms, without drastic institutional reforms, without changing the entire systems, I just don't think you could reform capitalism.
That's a really important point that you're making. I do want to give Valerie in a moment a chance to respond, but before I do, Frederic, what is your view? I mean, you are somebody who, a former chief executive of one of the world's biggest companies, who yourself have also worked with governments. What is your view of what Eric just said?
I agree with Eric that companies are not going to change because they are not built as such. I think only government can impose things to companies and people. And I think Valerie, you're right. This is going to be coming from the young generation because those young kids, and this young generation, they are built in a completely different way.
Valerie, over you, and we have a question coming in that basically plays off of what the both of you just said. A viewer is asking, can social ills be corrected under a capitalist system that focuses on profit?
So, look, I'm not a naive, I'm a pragmatist, actually. So I don't disagree with what Eric is saying. I mean, 25 years, I've grown up in that too. I'm 44 years old. That means half my life has been in the kind of like, oh, we're in this move too, right? Yes, the rivers have been polluted. We're on a trajectory to have more plastic in the oceans than fish. The Aral Sea, which was the 4th largest sea when I was born into the world in 1976, is now a carcinogenic desert floor bed with camels walking on it. Why? Not because of any kind of horrible ill will, but because the water was diverted by the Soviets for cotton production, for textile production, for clothing and fashion. So here you have this loss of wages, all the diseases, all of that. It was just unintended. Why? Because people were acting unconsciously. They weren't saying, oh, we had Rana Plaza, that was another failure. Why didn't that wake us up? So when we say, is business now there to clean up the act of the mess that it caused? There is a bit of that, that's yes. And then how can we connect into regulators and provide safe space? I'm not saying it has all the answers, but I will tell you, Liz, and the rest of you, it is the thing that is giving me hope. Because we are seeing also the same thing, a private equity company that is saying, oh, wait, we need to transform capital to be a force for good. This has been unsustainable. My children are all turning vegan and vegetarian on me. Why? Not because it's trendy and cool, but because they say they know the impact of animal agriculture on deforestation and on our environment. And so we need to help transform capital to be a force for good. And what does that mean for us? And so we see leaders waking up. And I'm not saying it is the answer, but I am saying that we can't sit here and admire the problem and say it's up to them. Is it government or is it up to business? We are the ones that we've been waiting for. And if we don't start showing up as human beings who say we need to be working together to say how do we create the environment that provides for long-term, multi-stakeholder, unless we're going to move into the kind of environment that Eric is in and become a socialist economies. But if we're not, then I would suggest to us that we've got to figure out this conscious capitalism, multi-stakeholder, firms that are providing for the well-being and care of others. And I would also suggest to us that the conversations that we are having with business leaders is that people are there. They know this works. That isn't a normal paradox and trade-off anymore. Then, so I'm not saying everybody is.
Well,
what I am
yeah.
saying is
We
that
could
enough people have
put
to.
it back.